She didn't wake up frightened, just hollow, like the world had erased her name with quiet, practiced hands. The train rolled on through nameless towns, and the dog at her side never barked, never left, never blinked. He simply waited for each stop, and when the doors opened, he led her like he knew what mattered. She followed, not because she trusted him, but because he was the only one who seemed to know her at all. She couldn't yet know that the small-town librarian still had the book she borrowed every month bookmarked with a red ribbon. She had no idea that words she once loved could still pull tears from her like a song half-remembered. She certainly had no idea that the quiet man in the corner cafe had once held her hand through a diagnosis neither of them dared name. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy heartfelt tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come. Now, let's begin. It all started with the sound of metal and the soft, rhythmic pull of wheels on worn steel. The kind of sound that doesn't wake you with a jolt, but slowly pulls you from sleep like a tide pulling at your feet, gentle but certain, dragging you toward a shore you can't quite see. She opened her eyes to the dull gray light of early morning filtering through a train window, the glass fogged with breath and time, the world beyond moving in slow motion past fields and old barns that seemed as lost as she felt. Her fingers trembled as she reached to steady herself, and that's when she realized she was holding something tightly, something crumpled and warm from her hand, a photograph, creased and worn at the edges, of a woman smiling beside a large German shepherd. She stared at the picture with a strange sense of detachment, like she was watching a movie from the back row of an empty theater, unable to place the characters but unwilling to look away. There was handwriting on the back, the kind that belongs to someone who wrote with purpose. Don't forget where you belong. She tried to speak, maybe a name, maybe a question, but her voice cracked in her throat like a dried leaf, and when she looked around the cabin, no one met her gaze. Except him. The dog. The shepherd sat beside her feet like a statue carved from loyalty itself, his ears twitching with every subtle sound, his eyes not darting, not watching, just holding her, quietly, as if to say, "You're not alone." Not yet. She reached for his fur without thinking, and it surprised her. The motion felt familiar, like muscle memory from another life, like petting this dog was something her body remembered even when her mind had gone blank. Outside, a station sign flashed by, faded, peeling, the name long forgotten, and then the train began to slow, brakes whispering like a tired old man trying not to disturb the silence. The dog rose before she did. He didn't bark or pull, didn't whine or pace. He simply stood, turned toward the door, and looked back over his shoulder with the calm expectancy of someone who knows what comes next. And though she couldn't yet understand why, she stood too. Not because she recognized the town. Not because someone called her name. She stood because he did. The platform was quiet when she stepped down. No one met her with arms outstretched. No one gasped or wept or called her home. But Scout, yes, somehow, she knew now that was his name, began walking down the platform without hesitation, his gait steady, his ears alert, his whole being drawn forward by something she couldn't see. And so she followed. They passed a diner with a cracked window, a hardware store with a help wanted sign faded by the sun, a church with a yellow steeple that gleamed faintly despite the clouds overhead. And every step they took felt strange in the way dreams feel strange, not surreal, but too real, too familiar, like walking a street you've never seen but somehow miss. An old man on a bench looked up as they passed and tipped his hat politely. "You two look like you've done this before," he said, voice full of rust and kindness. She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She wanted to ask, "Do you know me? Do I belong here?" But her mouth wouldn't form the words. The dog kept walking until he reached a narrow path between two houses, gravel crunching under his paws, and then, just before he turned, he looked back, as if asking, "Are you coming?" And though every bone in her body ached with uncertainty, she nodded, almost imperceptibly, and stepped off the sidewalk, into the unknown. A sign near the path read, "St. Agnes Home for Veterans and Widows." Scout stopped at the gate. Inside the courtyard, an old man in a wheelchair was feeding birds, tossing crumbs with the patience of someone who knew time no longer owed him anything. He looked up. His hand froze. His mouth opened slightly. And then he whispered, "Dear God, is that really you?" The old man's voice trembled as though it hadn't been used for something this fragile in a very long time, and when the woman asked him, almost in a whisper, "Do you know who I am?" he blinked twice before answering with the careful reverence of someone unwrapping a memory he'd long feared was lost. "I don't just know you, ma'am," he said, reaching out with a hand as thin as paper but steady with purpose. You once saved my life when neither bullets nor God showed much interest in doing so. She looked at him with wide, searching eyes, the kind of gaze you see on someone who's hearing their own name for the first time in years, and yet no recognition flickered, only the hollow echo of something deeper, buried beyond the reach of thought. Scout sat at her heel again, close enough to touch, as if his presence alone could hold her to the ground while the world around her shifted like sand under a tide that refused to turn back. You were there, the man said, motioning toward his chest, where a faded ribbon with a bronze star hung awkwardly against the fabric of his cardigan. It was 1971, Quang Tri Province, and I was 21, scared out of my mind, bleedin' like a stuck pig, callin' for my mama. His voice cracked on that last word, not from drama but from something more honest, a wound that had never quite closed, even after half a century of trying. You dropped to your knees right there in the mud, with mortars going off and men screaming, and you patched me up so fast my heart didn't even get a chance to quit on me, he said, smiling faintly, as if trying to comfort her with the warmth of something she'd given long ago. You called me son, even though I was older than you by a good few years, and you said, "You're not dying today. Not on my shift, sweetheart." The woman listened as though the words were written in fog, there one moment and gone the next, and for a heartbeat, she thought she could hear the distant thud of helicopters and the sharp ring of her own voice cutting through chaos, but it slipped away before she could catch it. "I was a nurse?" she asked softly, her voice almost childlike in its need for confirmation, for any piece of her to return. The man nodded slowly, eyes misted over now, though whether it was age or memory, even he couldn't say. "You weren't just a nurse, you were the one we looked for when the lights went out and the pain got louder than our prayers," he said, reaching out to gently take her hand. "We used to call you Angel Annie, but I never knew if that was your real name, or just the name we gave the woman who wouldn't let us die." She opened her mouth to speak again, but no sound came. Only the soft rustle of wind moving through the courtyard trees, and the steady, patient breathing of Scout beside her, as if he too were waiting to see if something would return. I don't remember that," she said, tears prickling at her eyes, not because she doubted the story, but because part of her wanted so badly for it to be true. "You don't have to remember it for it to still be part of you," the man said kindly, his grip not loosening, his gaze unwavering. "Sometimes, memory leaves before meaning does." She looked down at Scout, who hadn't taken his eyes off the man once, as if he too remembered something from a time when the woman wore different clothes and spoke with louder authority, saving lives with calm hands and fearless conviction. "I think I'm losing myself," she whispered, voice barely audible now, more breath than sound. The man chuckled gently, a soft, brittle sound that came from deep in his chest. "Honey, you can't lose what matters most. You only forget where you left it for a while." Then, slowly, he reached into the breast pocket of his sweater and pulled out a tiny, folded piece of paper, yellowed with time, creased a dozen times over, and held together by nothing more than care. "I've kept this for 53 years, he said, handing it to her with reverence. "It's the note you pinned to my jacket the day I was airlifted out. Said if I lived, I ought to start something that mattered." She unfolded it with trembling hands. Inside, in looping, hurried handwriting, were the words, "Keep going. Don't give up on the light. You're here for a reason." As she read it, her lips parted just slightly, and for the first time since waking on that train, she felt something stir, not a memory, exactly, but a truth returning to her, like a lighthouse blinking once through thick fog. Scout nudged her knee, gently but firmly, like he was reminding her it was time to move on. "I have to go," she said suddenly, looking up at the man. "I don't know where yet, but he does." The old soldier nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then follow him, ma'am. That dog hasn't lost the scent." And as she turned to leave, Scout already at the gate, she paused and asked, "Do you remember my name?" The man paused, as though searching through 1,000 dusty drawers in his mind, until finally he shook his head slowly. "I remember your voice, your hands, and your courage," he said. "But your name, that one's still out there, waiting for you to find it." She smiled, not because she was whole again, but because something had started to return, a sliver of warmth where only fear had been. And as she and Scout stepped back onto the quiet street, heading toward the next unknown, she looked toward the sky and asked aloud, as much to herself as to the dog, "Where do we go next, boy?" "Wherever you used to belong, ma'am," said the young librarian behind the desk, her voice calm but tinged with quiet awe. "I think this book might know the way." The library smelled like time, that blend of aged paper, polished oak, and memories left in the margins, and when the woman stepped inside, following Scout through the tall glass doors. It felt less like entering a building and more like crossing into a part of herself that had waited patiently in silence. Scout had paused just past the doorway, ears perked, his whole body still, as if listening for something more than sound, some whisper between the shelves that only he could hear. The librarian, a young woman with large eyes and a quiet reverence, had noticed them immediately, not with alarm or suspicion, but with a gentle kind of recognition that only someone who believes in the quiet magic of books could hold. "I've seen that dog before," she said softly, stepping out from behind her counter with a worn book in her hand. "I'm almost sure of it. He used to come in with a lady who always borrowed the same 3 novels, every single month, without fail." The woman looked at her, uncertain whether to believe or retreat, because nothing yet had offered certainty, only glimmers and fragments that danced like leaves in a restless wind. Scout moved forward first, his paws silent on the old wooden floor, and sat calmly beside the librarian, who knelt down and laid a hand gently on his head, as though greeting a friend who'd simply been gone too long. "You like to sit near the windows," she continued, looking up now at the woman, her voice tinged with something tender, almost fragile. "And you used to mark your place with this little torn slip of red ribbon, always the same piece, as if it meant something." She held out the book in her hand. Gone with the wind, the spine cracked from use, the edges soft from fingers that had visited the pages too often to count. The woman reached out with hesitation, her fingertips brushing the faded cover, and for a moment, her breath caught in her chest, not because she remembered, but because something deep inside her responded as though it did. "I think you read this book like it was a letter from home," the librarian said, placing it into her hands, like maybe the story was yours somehow. She opened it slowly, the pages turning with the weight of time, and about halfway through, there it was, a small, fraying piece of red ribbon folded between chapter 29 and chapter 30. The words on that page leapt out at her with sudden clarity, not because they sparked memory, but because they sounded like something she might have once said herself. "After all, tomorrow is another day." "I don't remember reading it," she said, her voice trembling not from fear but from the ache of near recognition. "But I feel like I know what happens next." Scout nudged her elbow gently with his nose, then laid down at her feet, his head resting on his paws, eyes watching her like a guardian who knows the road must be walked slowly. "You used to talk about books like they were people," the librarian said with a soft laugh, not mocking but full of respect. "You told me once that good stories don't give you answers, they give you mirrors." The woman blinked slowly, her gaze distant now, as if trying to reach across some great invisible chasm that still separated her from the self that used to live in this quiet place. She ran her hand across the inside cover of the book, and there, barely legible in the faded ink of a blue fountain pen, were the initials EB written in slanted script. "Does that mean anything to you?" the librarian asked gently, tilting her head, hope flickering behind her words. The woman stared at the letters for a long moment, then shook her head slowly, lips pressing together in frustration, tears threatening the edges of her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's like the memories are there, but someone turned out the light, and I can't find the switch." The librarian didn't rush to speak. Instead, she sat beside her, right there on the floor between the shelves, and said something simple but powerful. "Maybe you don't have to remember everything," she said, her voice softer now, like a lullaby. "Maybe it's enough to follow what still feels true." The woman turned towards Scout, whose eyes never strayed, and again she felt that gentle certainty rising from somewhere deeper than memory, from something much older, something faithful. "Did I used to live here?" she asked the librarian, hope edging into her tone like sunlight breaking through morning fog. The librarian shook her head slowly, almost regretfully. "You always came from the next town over," she said. "Someplace close, but never once did you say exactly where." And just as the woman was about to close the book, something slipped from between the pages, a small, yellowing photograph, no larger than a credit card, of a picnic under a tree near a lake, with a young couple smiling at each other, and a large German shepherd curled up at their feet. The woman stared at the photo, then at Scout, then back again, and her hand began to tremble so subtly that only Scout noticed, and with great care, he rose and laid his head in her lap as though to steady her heart. "Do you recognize the man?" the librarian asked, peering over her shoulder, her voice cautious but curious. The woman leaned in closer to the photo, her eyes searching the man's face, and for the first time, something stirred, not a memory, not quite, but a feeling like the ghost of laughter, like the echo of warmth she once knew. "No," she said slowly, "but I think I loved him." And the photograph, resting quietly in her hand, gave no answer, only a silence so profound it felt like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Scout stood up again, gently nudging her shoulder as if to say, "That's enough for now. But there's more." The librarian rose with them and held out a folded slip of paper, a list of titles, the woman's past borrowing history, a breadcrumb trail of old favorites and familiar comforts. "You always left with 3 books," she said, handing the paper over. "The next one on your list is in the next town over. You used to say it was your secret place." The woman took the paper, folded it slowly, and looked at the librarian with quiet gratitude. Then, as she turned to leave, she asked softly, "Do you believe people can come back from forgetting?" The librarian hesitated only a second, then smiled with the quiet conviction of someone who believes in things they can't always prove. "I believe some stories are just too beautiful to stay buried forever," she said. "That's her," said the man, pointing toward the woman on the sidewalk with the kind of certainty that comes not from guesswork, but from memory etched into the bones. "She's the one who gave my daughter the bicycle." The words came like a stone dropped into still water, quiet, but with ripples that reached farther than anyone could measure in the moment. The woman turned her head slowly, her hand gently resting on Scout's neck for balance, not because she was physically unsteady, but because the weight of not knowing, not remembering, had become heavier than any limp or old wound. They had only just stepped off the train at the next town, the 4th stop since she first awoke without a name, and already, something in the air had changed. The streets here were quiet, dotted with single-story homes and rusting mailboxes, each one a little sun-faded, a little bent, as though the years had gently leaned on everything, just enough to make it all feel real. The man, tall and wiry, with salt and pepper hair tucked beneath a mechanic's cap, stepped out from behind the chain-link fence that guarded a modest front yard filled with broken toys and overgrown grass. In his hands, he held something wrapped in a weathered towel, something the woman didn't notice at first, because her eyes were fixed on the small figure that appeared behind him. A girl, no older than 8 or 9, rolled carefully out from the porch in a small wheelchair, her dark hair braided neatly, her eyes wide with a kind of wonder that didn't come from cartoons or fairy tales, but from real, lived kindness. "Emma," the man called gently over his shoulder. "It's her, the lady I told you about. The one with the red bicycle." The girl's face lit up with something just shy of joy, and she slowly wheeled herself closer, until she was barely a few feet from the woman, who stood motionless except for the slow rise and fall of her chest. "I don't remember," the woman said quietly, eyes filling with something close to sorrow, "but I want to." The man nodded, not unkindly, as if he'd expected those words all along. "You came into my shop 2 years ago," he said, unfolding the towel to reveal an old bicycle, freshly repainted in bright red with silver streamers still fluttering from the handlebars. "You said you didn't have children of your own, but you believed every child should know the freedom of 2 wheels." The woman reached out slowly, fingers brushing against the chipped paint on the bike's frame, and again, something stirred. Not a clear picture, but a sensation, a warmth in the chest, like sunlight through a window you forgot was there. "She was born with brittle bones," the man continued, his voice catching only slightly. "Doctors told us she might never walk, and maybe she never would have, but that bike gave her wings anyway." Scout sat beside the girl now, tail thumping softly, leaning just enough into her hand so she wouldn't be afraid. "You gave it to us and said, 'Don't worry if she falls. It's getting up that counts.'" The girl nodded slowly, a shy smile creeping onto her face. "I practiced in the driveway every day," she said, "even if it was just a few feet." The woman knelt beside her without even thinking, knees creaking in protest, and gently touched the girl's hand. "I'm sorry I don't remember," she said softly, "but I believe I meant every word." The girl leaned forward, pressing something small and folded into the woman's palm, a drawing, clearly made with care, crayon on paper, of a woman, a dog, and a red bicycle under a big blue sky. "I made it in case I ever saw you again," she said simply. Tears slipped down the woman's cheek, quiet and uncontrolled, not from pain, but from the quiet grace of being remembered, even when she couldn't do the same. The man placed a hand on her shoulder then, steady and kind. "You never asked for thanks," he said, "but I think you need to know, what you gave us was more than a bike. You gave us a reason to believe." She looked toward the train station then, where the engine was still huffing patiently, and something inside her tightened. "I've left pieces of myself all over these towns," she whispered, half to herself, half to the wind. "Will I ever get them back?" Scout stood slowly, brushing against her arm like a soft current nudging her forward, and she knew without looking that it was time to go. The man didn't try to stop her. He simply nodded again and said, "Some things you don't need to remember. They remember you." She turned toward him one last time, heart aching in that strange, bittersweet way only the elderly truly understand. That blend of gratitude and grief that comes from outliving your own story. And as she and Scout began walking once more, the little girl called out, "Do you think you'll ever come back?" The woman paused, looked over her shoulder, and said gently, "If I do, will you remind me again?" The girl nodded solemnly. "I'll keep the picture by the door." The sun had begun to set now, painting the clouds with streaks of orange and gold, and as they reached the edge of town, Scout stopped and looked back once more, his eyes lingering not just on the people, but on something deeper, the memory they held for her, like a candle kept burning in a window long after the guest has gone. The woman wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, then asked aloud, voice soft but determined, "Where did I go next, boy?" "You came here once a year," said the groundskeeper, his voice carrying the slow rhythm of a man who'd seen too many seasons pass without rush. "Every time on the same day, no matter the weather, no matter how far you had to come." The train had arrived just after dawn, when the mist still clung low over the earth like a forgotten memory unwilling to rise. And as the woman stepped off with Scout at her side, she felt the air grow heavier, not with dread, but with something older, quieter, the kind of weight that doesn't come from fear, but from meaning. This town was smaller than the others, its streets narrower, its buildings more weathered, and yet it held itself with the dignified hush of a place where people still spoke in low tones out of respect for the past. Scout walked ahead with purpose, more certain than ever, following a winding gravel path that led up the hillside behind a row of modest homes, past a crumbling stone wall nearly swallowed by ivy, and through an iron gate that had long since forgotten how to shut properly. The woman didn't ask where they were going this time. She already knew, somehow, that whatever waited beyond that gate would not be warm, would not speak, but would say more than any words ever could. The cemetery was old, with tilting headstones and names faded by wind and rain, yet each one still stood as if determined not to be erased by time, no matter how many storms tried. It was there, near the top of the hill where the pines stood tallest, that she saw the groundskeeper, a stooped man in a denim coat, with hands the color of soil and a face lined like tree bark. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "I always figured you'd come back," he said, tipping his cap, then leaning on his shovel like it was an old friend. "I just didn't expect it to take this long." She opened her mouth to speak, but the truth, the whole, aching truth, sat behind her teeth like a stone, and all she could manage was, "I don't remember." He studied her for a moment, not with judgment, but with the patient understanding of a man who had buried both bodies and secrets, and never once confused the two. "You used to come up that path every March 21st, he said, glancing toward a particular row of stones nestled beneath a low-hanging cedar. "Never missed a year. You always brought the same thing, a single white lily, and a thermos of coffee." She followed his gaze slowly, heart tightening with each step, scalp brushing against her leg like a tether to the world she was still trying to re-enter. The headstone wasn't fancy, no grand carving, no elaborate message, just a simple name and 2 dates, barely etched deep enough to defy erosion. Clara May Barrett, 1951 to 2004. Beloved sister, teacher, friend. The woman stared at the name, her breath catching as a sudden gust of wind rattled the cedar branches above them, and for a brief, piercing moment, she could feel it, not the memory, but the pain left behind by its absence. "You sat right there," the groundskeeper said gently, pointing to a moss-covered bench just beside the grave. "Sometimes for an hour. Sometimes until the sun went down. You never cried, but your hands always shook when you poured the coffee." "I don't know who she was to me," the woman whispered, though her knees were already giving way beneath her, lowering her slowly to sit on that same bench as if the earth itself remembered where she belonged. "Some folks say grief makes you forget things," he replied, settling beside her on the stone ledge. "But I've seen the opposite more often. It makes you remember things you never meant to." She stared at the name again, searching it for meaning, for something to stir, and then it hit her. Not a memory, but a feeling. She called me Ellie," she murmured, barely audible. "I don't know how I know that, but I can hear her voice, just that name, like it's floating in water." Scout let out a low, almost imperceptible whine, as if agreeing or remembering to. The groundskeeper nodded slowly, as if that tiny thread was all the confirmation he needed. She died young, he said softly. Cancer. You were there for all of it. Every appointment, every treatment, every time she couldn't speak, you spoke for her. The woman felt her hands begin to tremble now, not with fear, but with the quiet force of something sacred rising from the deep. I was her sister, she whispered, and the words felt both foreign and familiar, like trying on a coat you used to wear every winter but hadn't touched in years. She was your only family, he confirmed. After she passed, you came here to see her like she was still the only one who could hear you. Her gaze drifted to the pine trees beyond the stone, where the wind whispered through their needles like a voice carried over time. And every year, he added, you'd leave something else behind, sometimes a page from a book, sometimes a note, and once a dog collar. She turned toward Scout, eyes wide, breath catching in her throat. You said he belonged to both of you, the groundskeeper said. Said he wouldn't let you grieve alone. She reached for Scout then, holding his face in her hands, tears finally spilling over her cheeks as he leaned into her touch with quiet trust. I didn't lose just her, she said. I lost everything that told me who I was. The groundskeeper stood, brushing dust from his jeans, and looked down at her with something close to reverence. Sometimes the pain is what keeps the love from leaving entirely, he said. But it's also what makes it so hard to return. She looked up at him through blurred vision and asked, Did I ever talk about anyone else? About someone waiting. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. There was a man, he said. You never said much, just that he loved apple pie, hated wearing ties, and had a laugh you could hear through a storm. The woman pressed her hand to her heart then, as if something inside had knocked to be let out. Do you know where he is? She asked, voice trembling. The old man didn't answer right away. He simply pointed toward the train station below, where the tracks stretched eastward through the trees. I don't, he said at last, but I know where your next stop was. You always boarded the afternoon train right after visiting Clara. Scout stood again, ready, steady, already facing the path downhill as if he, too, remembered the schedule. And as the woman turned to follow him, she asked one final question, her voice soft but sure. If I was always going somewhere after this, what was I trying to find? You were looking for your home, said the boy on the porch, with a voice too young for certainty but too old for denial, but it doesn't belong to you anymore. The words didn't come with cruelty or defiance, they came with the stillness of a child who's had to learn things too early, who's overheard more than his share of whispered conversations behind closed doors, who understands that people disappear sometimes. And not always on purpose. The train had pulled in just after lunch, its whistle low and tired, as though even the engine itself carried the weight of her journey. Scout had jumped down first, as always, sniffing the gravel, ears perked toward the wind, his nose pointing not toward the shops or cafes, but to the narrow road that led west, toward the houses with the picket fences and the mailboxes with fading names. She hadn't questioned him this time. She followed, drawn not by reason or memory, but by a quiet urgency in her bones, the kind of instinct that doesn't speak in words but still leaves no room for argument. The walk was long, longer than it should have been, and yet with every step, something inside her began to tighten, not in fear, but in strange, aching recognition. She knew the curve of that sidewalk before it appeared. She knew the way the oak tree leaned over the fence, as if tired from decades of watching children grow. She even knew the smell in the air, a mix of cut grass, cracked paint, and something faintly sweet, like the last slice of pie cooling in a kitchen forgotten by time. And then she saw it. The house. It wasn't large or grand, just a single-story bungalow with peeling white trim and a crooked mailbox, but it had a window framed in robin's egg blue, bright even through the dust of years. Her breath caught in her chest like a song she hadn't sung in years but still knew the opening note. Scout stopped at the front gate. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply waited, head low, tail still, his body tense with a reverence only dogs, and perhaps old friends, know how to show. The boy appeared on the porch a moment later, sitting cross-legged beside a bowl of cereal and a walkie-talkie, squinting into the sunlight with the squirming discomfort of someone not used to visitors, especially ones like her. You used to live here, huh? He asked, not rising, not mocking, just asking with a curiosity that felt older than his years. She didn't answer right away, because even though she didn't remember it, she could feel it. Feel herself in that doorway, keys jingling in one hand, grocery bag in the other. Feel herself watering the flowers beneath that blue window, humming without realizing it. Feel herself laughing with someone across the table, too loud, too open, like a person who never thought silence would come. I don't know, she finally whispered, more to herself than to him. But something of me is still here. The boy nodded solemnly, as if that answer made perfect sense. My mom says the lady who used to live here moved away after something bad happened, he said, voice lowered slightly. She said the lady got lost one day and never found her way back. Scout whined softly at those words, his head dropping against her leg, his body heavy as if the weight of that truth finally pulled him back to the porch of that memory. I think you're her, the boy added, looking at her not with suspicion, but with something close to awe. I think you're the one who left the swing out back. She turned then, her body moving before her mind gave permission, and walked slowly around the side of the house. The garden was overgrown now, weeds reaching where roses once bloomed, but the old swing still hung from the maple tree, the ropes frayed, the seat cracked, but still there. And in that moment, a sound escaped her lips, not a word, not a name, but something closer to a sob, the kind that lives in the chest of people who haven't let themselves feel anything in too long. Scout climbed onto the porch beside the boy and lay down, his eyes never leaving her, watching as she moved through the echoes of her past like a ghost unsure if it had the right to return. Did I leave on purpose? She asked the boy after a long silence. Or did someone forget to come find me? He shrugged, looking away. Maybe both, he said. But my mom says sometimes people leave before they mean to, and sometimes they come back before they're ready. She stepped toward the back door then, fingers brushing the frame, hand lingering on the faded wood. Inside, she could hear movement, footsteps, a television, a kettle starting to whistle. Another life now filled this space. A new family with their own photos, their own laughter, their own pain. She didn't knock. She didn't open the door. Instead, she sat on the back step, closed her eyes, and let the warmth of the sun press against her face like an old friend's hand. Scout rested beside her, head on her foot, the way he always did when he sensed she needed to feel something steady. I lived here, she said softly, not in question, but in certainty. I remember the sound of the swing. I remember the light in the kitchen. Then, after a long pause, she added, but this isn't mine anymore. It's someone else's turn now. The boy appeared again, standing quietly near the steps. He held something in his hand, an old key on a faded ribbon, the kind people use to hide beneath flower pots or tuck in drawers too shallow to matter. We found this in the floor vent, he said. My mom said to throw it out, but I kept it. I don't know why. She took it carefully, as if it might break, and smiled through her tears. Because something in you knew it still meant something, she said. Scout stood again, stretching slowly, then nudged her toward the side path the way they'd come. The boy waved once more, not with goodbye, but with a promise that he would remember her, even if she never came back. As they reached the sidewalk, the woman turned to Scout and asked quietly, as the wind stirred the branches behind them. If I gave this place up, what could have possibly mattered more? He called you, Annie, said the nurse, brushing a loose strand of gray hair behind her ear as she opened the door to the sunroom, but we're not sure who he thinks you are anymore. Her voice was kind, careful, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who spent too many years watching fragile minds unravel like old sweaters, thread by quiet thread, until the only thing left is a smile that doesn't match the name it's given. The woman hesitated on the threshold, her fingers tightening around the photo in her pocket, the one from the library, the one with the couple under the tree, the dog curled at their feet, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if stepping through that doorway would offer another answer or simply another ache. Scout moved first, his paws clicking gently against the linoleum floor, his head low, his gait slow but deliberate, as though he understood this place didn't ask for energy, but for grace. The room smelled like lemon oil and stale coffee, the kind of scent that clings to quiet institutions where the living spend their final chapters waiting for something, a visitor, a birthday, a soft end. He was seated near the window, in a chair too large for his frame now, his hands folded neatly in his lap as if trained by decades of routine, and his eyes, though clouded by age, locked onto her the instant she crossed the threshold. Annie, he whispered, voice dry and paper-thin, but carrying something behind it that made her stop walking. The nurse placed a gentle hand on her arm and added, in a low voice, he hasn't spoken a name in weeks. He's confused most days. But today, he asked to sit by the window. Said he had someone coming. The woman stepped closer, each movement as careful as if walking across ice, not from fear of falling, but from fear of breaking something already cracked. He reached for her hand without hesitation, his fingers gnarled but steady, and when he touched her, he let out a sigh so deep it felt like a story finally being told after years of silence. You came back, he said. I told them you would. I told them Annie always comes back. She opened her mouth to correct him, to say I'm not her, to explain the weight she carried, the missing pieces, the gaps in the mirror, the names she couldn't remember, and the places that only felt familiar by scent or sound. But she couldn't say anything. Because for one terrible, beautiful second, she wanted to be Annie. She wanted to sit beside this man, hold his hand, and tell him that yes, she remembered the wedding vows and the late-night dancing in the kitchen and the smell of sawdust on his flannel shirt. She wanted to lie, not out of cruelty, but out of mercy. Instead, she sat. Scout curled at her feet, his breathing slow, as if this, too, was part of a ritual long forgotten by everyone but him. The man began to talk, slowly, softly, as if unspooling ribbon from a box only he could open. He spoke of a cabin by a lake, where the trees leaned in close and the loons cried at night like distant, lonely children. He told her how Annie used to hum the same tune every morning, a tune from a record they wore out long ago, the one that skipped on the second chorus, but she sang through it anyway. He described her laugh, bright and reckless, like a woman who knew life could be heavy but chose to carry it lightly. He spoke of things she didn't recognize, but still, her eyes welled, her heart aching not because it stirred memory, but because it stirred longing. And longing, she now knew, could be just as sharp as memory when sharpened by loneliness. Then, with trembling fingers, he reached into the inside pocket of his cardigan and pulled out something wrapped in tissue, a pressed flower, long-dried, fragile as ash. I kept this, he said, from the last time we walked down by the dock. You picked it from the shore and said it wouldn't last, but I didn't care. She took it gently, afraid to crush it with her breath alone, and held it as though it might sing the truth to her if she listened long enough. The nurse stepped back, giving them space, her eyes glistening in a way that only someone who's watched hundreds of final chapters can understand, not with detachment, but with reverence. And then, the man smiled. Not a confused smile. Not the smile of someone seeing a shadow of a face they used to know, but a peaceful smile. As if, in calling her Annie, he had found his way home, even if just for a few more breaths. The woman leaned forward then, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "Whoever she was, she must have loved you very much." And he nodded. Once. Slowly. Eyes already slipping closed, his smile still resting on his face like a last warm sunrise. She sat beside him until his breathing grew shallow, until the sun lowered behind the window and the nurse returned to say it was time to let go. When she stood, Scout rose with her, and as they walked slowly toward the exit, the woman turned to the nurse and asked, voice barely above a whisper, "Do you think she was real, the Annie you loved?" "She was real," the nurse replied softly, her eyes following the woman and Scout as they stepped toward the corridor light. But maybe the Annie he saw wasn't just her. Maybe it was everyone he ever missed, everyone he ever hoped would come back and sit beside him one last time. Those words followed her all the way back to the train, not loud, not commanding, but steady as the sound of her own footsteps, echoing faintly against the tiled floors of a world built for waiting. As the train rolled forward, Scout curled beside her again, his body pressed gently against her leg, his breath slow and deep, as if he understood the grief wasn't his to carry, but he could still keep it from falling. The sky beyond the window shifted toward twilight, the color of old postcards and cigarette smoke, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap, not touching the photograph, not reading the paper from the library, just still, just listening to the hush between the rails. This time, when the train slowed at the next stop, no conductor made an announcement, no voice crackled over the speaker, and no one else stepped off but her. The station was the smallest yet, a single bench beneath a warped awning, a rusted vending machine humming with a sound too tired to be mechanical, and a clock with no hands. Scout stepped onto the platform first, his pause pausing only briefly before leading her past the bench, across the cracked pavement, and into the fading silence of a town that seemed more forgotten than remembered. There were no people here, no voices, no stores open, no cars moving. Only the faint rustle of a breeze and the sound of her own breath catching in her throat as they walked down a narrow street lined with shuttered windows and porches sagging under the weight of long empty rocking chairs. She kept going. Because Scout did. And then, they stopped. In front of a building with no sign. No name above the door. No welcome mat. Only a wooden bench pressed beneath a window, dust clinging to the glass, as if time had been waiting without a reason to move forward. She sat. Scout lay down at her feet. And for the first time since she had woken up on that train so many miles ago, there was no story waiting to greet her, no stranger with a piece of her past in their hand, no hint of who she had been or what she had lost. There was only silence. And it stretched. She stared at her hands, at the creases that told her she'd lived long enough to forget things once held dear, and the tremble in her fingers made her wonder if something else was slipping away, something she hadn't noticed until now. Is this where the trail ends? She whispered aloud, not to Scout, not to the town, but to the part of herself that had led her this far without a map. And still, nothing answered. She looked down at the photograph again, the one from the book. The lake. The tree. The man. The dog. And she stared at the man's face, not because she recognized it, but because she didn't want to die without knowing if he still remembered hers. Scout sat up then, suddenly, and stared toward the far end of the street, where the horizon blurred with the color of coming night. His ears twitched, his whole body tensed, and he whined, not loudly, not in fear, but with the urgency of something long buried surfacing at last. She followed his gaze. There was nothing there. No person. No movement. Only the gentle bend of the road, leading toward the hills, leading toward whatever came next. And still, Scout waited. She reached for his collar, not to hold him back, but to steady herself, as if the quiet was pulling at her chest like gravity, reminding her how fragile direction can be when no one is left to tell you where you belong. Then, suddenly, a voice. Faint. Male. Tired. Is someone out there? She turned. It came from behind the building, a voice wrapped in hesitation and dust. Scout darted forward, his tail straight, not wagging, not still, somewhere in between. She followed, her heart pounding in her chest with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years, a rhythm that wasn't fear, wasn't hope, but the strange electric charge of something about to matter again. Behind the station stood a man, disoriented, wearing slippers and a jacket too large for his frame, his hands shaking slightly as he shaded his eyes. Annie, he asked. Are you back? She froze. Another Annie. Another man reaching for a name that wasn't hers. The nurse's words echoed in her mind. Maybe the Annie he saw wasn't just her. Maybe it was everyone he ever missed. He stepped forward, cautiously, his eyes trying to focus on her face. I'm not her, she said gently. I wish I could be, but I'm not. He paused, then smiled sadly, the kind of smile people wear when truth and memory no longer speak the same language. She had a voice like yours, he whispered. Soft. Like water in the sink while she peeled apples. The image hit her with a strange sharpness, not because she remembered it, but because she could feel it. Feel the peel curling in her hand. Feel the light above the counter. Feel the man behind her, arms wrapped around her waist, laughing against her neck. She closed her eyes and almost said yes. Almost told this man what he needed to hear. But she didn't. She sat beside him instead, and they watched the sky turn. And for a while, neither of them spoke. Then, she asked quietly, How long have you been waiting here? The man tilted his head, as if trying to count something invisible. Every day since she left, he said. She said she'd be back on the 5:10. She nodded slowly. Scout lay down between them, his body stretching out as if to say, This is all we can do. Wait. Listen. Believe. And as the first star blinked into the sky above the empty station, the woman whispered one question she had never dared to ask before. What if I've already passed the stop where I belong? You haven't missed it, said a quiet voice behind her, worn smooth by time and solitude, yet carrying the weight of unmistakable certainty. In fact, it's just around the bend. She turned slowly, careful not to stir the man beside her who had drifted into a sleep, so deep it felt closer to memory than rest. Her heart didn't leap, didn't race, not anymore. The journey had taught her to let each moment arrive softly, without reaching too far ahead. The voice belonged to a man standing just beyond the shadows of the station's edge, not young, not frail, but shaped by years like river stone, not broken, only worn into something truer. In his hand, he held a thermos, dented and scuffed, the kind that might have belonged to a construction worker or a fisherman, or someone who understood the value of keeping something warm in a cold, waiting world. And in his other hand, cradled gently in a square of waxed paper, was a slice of apple pie, not store-bought, not perfect, but real, with a crust a little uneven and sugar caramelized at the edge like it had been baked for someone who mattered. Scout was the first to react, rising to his feet without hesitation, tail stiffening, body alert but not tense, as if he recognized something not with his eyes, but with his soul. He stepped toward the man slowly, one paw at a time, like a soldier returning to familiar ground, and when he reached him, he sat at his feet and looked up, eyes wide, chest rising with deep, steady breaths. The man crouched carefully, knees cracking, back stiff, and ran a hand along Scout's head with the reverence of someone brushing dust from a photograph they couldn't bear to throw away. Still loyal, he murmured, voice breaking ever so slightly. still watching out for her. The woman remained still, unsure whether to speak or watch, heart caught in that tight space between hope and disbelief, like someone listening for the final note of a song they thought they'd forgotten. The man looked up then, his eyes meeting hers across the distance, not sharp, not questioning, but patient, as though he had been standing in that same spot for years and would continue to do so for as long as it took. "I wasn't sure it was today," he said, rising to his feet, brushing his pants absently. "But I brought the pie anyway. And the coffee. Just in case." She took a hesitant step forward, then another. And with each step, the world around her seemed to quiet, the wind stilling, the sounds of the town fading into nothing but the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes. "You know me?" she asked, the words trembling as they left her lips, afraid they might shatter if they met silence. He didn't answer with a name, or a date, or a story. He only nodded, once, slowly. "Every day, I came here," he said. "For months. Then years. I'd pour the coffee, slice the pie, and sit on that bench, just in case the train that rolled by carried you back. I didn't know who I was," she whispered, voice barely audible. "I still don't, not all of it. I don't even know where I've been." "That's all right," he said, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a folded photograph, the very same one she had carried with her this whole time, though older, more faded, and soft at the corners like it had been held many, many nights. "You knew where you were going," he said, "even if you didn't know why, and you knew to take him with you." He handed her the photo gently, fingers lingering as they brushed hers, and for a moment, their touch said more than anything their memories could. She looked down at the image, the tree, the lake, the man, the dog, and this time, when her eyes found the faces, her breath caught not from confusion, but from the echo of something deep and familiar stirring. "That's us?" she asked, more afraid of the answer than she expected to be. He smiled, weary and full. "It always was," he said. "Even after the forgetting started. Even after you left without meaning to." Scout circled once, then laid down at her feet again, as if the final piece of his long mission had at last fallen into place. "I looked everywhere," she said, tears breaking free without shame. "In towns and faces and books. I followed his pause because I didn't know where else to go. And still," the man said, pouring 2 cups of coffee from the thermos, his hands steady despite the years, "you found your way home." He handed her the cup, warm in her fingers, steam curling like breath in the cooling evening. The pie rested between them on the bench now, and for a moment, they sat in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because some truths do not ask for words. She sipped the coffee. Strong, slightly sweet, just the way she would have liked it, if she could remember how she used to take it. Then, she looked at him again. "Did we have a life together?" she asked softly. He looked into her eyes, not searching, not testing, but seeing. And in that long, quiet moment, he reached across and gently took her hand in his. "You still do," he said, "if you want it." And as Scout curled tighter at her feet, tail wagging once, then still, she let the silence linger, not because she feared it, but because she was no longer alone in it. Then, with the light beginning to fade and the first train whistle sounding again in the distance, she looked up and asked the final question of the evening. "What's my name?" "Your name," he said gently, not letting go of her hand as the twilight settled around them like an old quilt, "is Eleanor Barrett, and you are my wife." The words did not crash down upon her like thunder, nor did they pull tears from her eyes in some grand cinematic swell. They arrived softly, carried not by force but by years, and they settled into her like the final puzzle piece that had waited too long to come home. Scout stirred at her feet, his ears twitching as if he too had been waiting for those words, not with impatience, but with faith, the quiet kind that never stops believing even when the world forgets to keep track. She sat still, her breath held, her eyes searching his face not for recognition, but for confirmation that what he said wasn't a dream or a kindness, but the truth she had feared might be gone forever. "I was married?" she asked, not out of disbelief, but with the wonder of someone who had always hoped for such a thing to be true. "You still are," he said, smiling with that weary steadiness that only a man who's walked through time and loss could wear. "You were my light, my compass, my stubborn girl who could out-talk a preacher and out-love the darkest days." He reached into the pocket of his coat, slower now, age tugging at each movement, and pulled out something small and simple, a gold band on a faded chain, the inscription inside worn down by decades of skin and salt and clenching fists through sleepless nights. "You took it off when Clara got sick," he said, voice low, remembering not just the facts but the weight of them. "Said your hands were too full to carry anything more. I kept it, waiting for the day you'd come back and be able to wear it again." She took it in her palm, feeling the warmth of his body still clinging to the metal, and with it came a rush not of images, but of sensations. Laughter in the kitchen, the hush of breath against her cheek, the shared silence of two people who no longer needed to explain themselves. And then, her name. It came, not in a jolt, not with fire, but like a soft breeze that turns your face toward home without asking. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of its return. "I remember. He used to call me El." The man nodded, tears rising now, not from pain but from the sheer mercy of hearing her say it after so many years of calling into the wind. "And you called me Sam," he said, his voice cracking for the first time. "Sometimes Sammy, when you were tired or teasing me." She reached out then, touched his face, the face she didn't yet see clearly but knew by feel, by history, by the part of her that had not, in fact, been lost, only sleeping. "I left," she said, not as an apology, but as a truth. "I walked out that door and didn't know how to find my way back." "You didn't leave me," he said firmly, gently, with conviction only love could sustain. "Your mind did, but your heart stayed. That dog never stopped watching the door. And I never stopped packing coffee and pie for the train that might carry you home." Scout whined quietly then, resting his head on Eleanor's shoe, his body heavy now, as if some great mission had finally ended. She looked down at him, brushed her fingers through the fur on his head, and whispered, "You brought me back, didn't you?" The man nodded once more. "You trained him," Sam said. "Years ago. When the first signs came, when names started slipping, and rooms didn't look the same, you said, 'If I forget where I belong, he won't.'" Eleanor gasped, the truth of it hitting like sunrise. "I did that." "Yes," he said. "You taught him to find home, to bring you back. And when the day came that you stepped out and didn't come home, he followed you. All the way." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. And for the first time since the train, since the photograph, since the library, since the cemetery and the child and the wrong names and the quiet grief, she felt the weight of her own body return to her, grounded not in fear, but in knowing. "You waited all this time?" she asked, the tears finally falling, not from sorrow but from grace. He smiled again, the same smile she saw in the photo, the one she remembered now not as an image but as a presence. "Every day," he said. "Because I knew you weren't gone. You were just looking." Scout stood then, slowly, painfully, and placed his head in her lap. And in that moment, she bent forward, cupped his face in her hands, and whispered, "You can rest now, sweet boy. We're home." That night, they did not ride the train. They stayed on the platform, three souls under a sky full of stars, with pie between them and coffee growing cold, and the kind of silence that doesn't beg to be filled. Later, they walked back together, her arm in Sam's, Scout trailing beside them, toward the house by the lake, the one in the photograph, the one waiting with its porch light still on. And as the door opened, she stepped through and breathed in the scent of her life, applewood, old books, and his cologne, faint on the coat he'd never stopped hanging by the door. Scout curled up on the rug beside the hearth, his tail thumping once before falling still. She stood in the center of the room, her hand resting in Sam's, and said, as if blessing the space, "My name is Eleanor Barrett, and I am home. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care."